Today we'll be talking about regulating AI. Just for everyone who's joining for the first time, we are Skive, a San Francisco and London-based company building autonomous machines that could feel. Today our topic is on regulating AI. So what are the policies and regulations around AI and why do we actually need it? We will have some questions and I will try to answer them. And in the meantime, I will give you a couple of examples on why do we need to regulate AI. We need to regulate AI not because very soon we will have killer drones which will go haywire, just like you see in movies. That will probably not happen. Although we have examples of killer drones where the drones are fitted with guns and bombs that have been used for good stuff, not for bad stuff. Australia is one example where they're using drones for which has machine guns on top. It has also been used in here in the U.S. If we talk about the drones in U.S. that's being used in to over terrorists. AI is being used, but most of the time there is a human in the loop. What we should be afraid about, and those use cases are happening today, is where AI really needs regulation, and it's needed not tomorrow, not a week after, it's needed today. A notable example is what happened in the United Kingdom. So the case involving Bridges and South Wales Police, where there was a conflict between importance of the state and individual rights due to the lack of diligence by the South Wales Police. In a sense, they were using facial recognition, and what ended up happening was that there was not really clear if there was bias involved in the facial recognition software that they were using. The courts did say that it's okay to use facial recognition by police, and this is for the UK. But there was not enough evidence from South Wales Police that there was no biases involved in the facial recognition software, or there was no assurance that something can go wrong. There was no documentation. Another example, again, that relates to COVID-19 is in early 2020, pandemic resulted in cancellation of A-level exams that are administered in the UK high school across England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And instead of, because the exams were not available because the kids were not able to do these exams that get them to the best schools, a predictive algorithm was used. And one of the essence of that was how do we figure out whether a student who got a B in the past will again get a B or an A. It's a lose-lose situation. So if somebody gets unassigned grade or somebody gets a bad grade, they will say that they could have done better, and there was a huge issue on the UK side for that. And the problem was that the regulators didn't do the diligence to figure out whether they should use it or not. Back here in the United States, the same issue happened in San Francisco, California, where the San Francisco School District said, we were not able to give the standardized examination to the high school for enrolling in one of the well-renowned high school, lowest high school here in San Francisco. So we will just use a random algorithm to enroll the students. To some extent, the bias issue didn't come into picture here because it was just a simple algorithm. It was not even using AI. It's just like a flip of a coin. So heads, you get into this really good school. Tails, you don't. But these issues are prominent. So these three issues should actually tell you that AI regulations, even at the simplest term, is needed today. And it affects each and every one of us, even if you don't know it. So our first question is, what regulations do you think government should make in order to protect the privacy and ethical concern of citizens when using AI technologies? To some extent, that relates to my first example of South Wales Police, where they were using facial recognition software, where they didn't do enough diligence. And when I say they didn't do enough diligence, it's not just about the government who actually deployed the system. It also the organizations and the corporation and the system integrators who actually created those systems. It's also not just about the technology used, it's also about the human importance. To have an AI system that performs well and that could help us, the citizens, we need to think about two broad things. One is the technology. And we on the Skive side have been working on AI regulation for some time, and we call it the technical assessment. So whether it's sensible to use AI, whether there's a rationality to use AI in a system, what is the quality of the data that we're using to create that AI system, if we are talking about deep learning, or what is the quality of the AI algorithm itself, whether that's being thoroughly tested. Equally important is the human importance assessment. So two things there. One is individual rights, which relates to privacy, security, and how will these fundamental rights can be affected by use of that AI algorithm. And the second is importance to the state. We are living in a society where, as we have seen in COVID-19, that the importance of the state is becoming more and more important, and there needs to be a division between what can the state do and how much power a state has, as well as how much they actually help us. And that's where importance to the state comes into picture, and AI as a tool definitely helps to bridge the gap, to get the government to help us. And these two things combined is what's needed. And regulation is not something which is only the responsibility of the government. The government is just the enabler. When it comes to quality of the AI system or whether AI should be used, it's also the responsibility of the developers, the corporations, the technology players, the system integrators on thinking about all these aspects, have proper documentation, have proper resources to make sure things work as they are told. Okay, we have another question. The second aspect this question mentioned is about ethical concerns. Ethics is a huge concern when we think about artificial intelligence. And the biggest component of that, or the way we could more clearly remove some of the issues that relate to ethical use of AI, is transparency. Is it possible for us to build a framework where the AI is much more transparent? When I say transparency, it does not always involve looking at the source code of a specific algorithm or how the AI algorithm has been implemented. We on the Skive side have been working on AI regulation, and we're proposing this through few articles that we have published in the past, and we'll be doing few more in the coming days and weeks, where we have made a case that for an AI system or algorithm to be transparent, you do not have to disclose the IP associated with it. You do not have to disclose the data. And a transparency system, to some extent, is also related to how can you build up a framework for the general public and citizens to see what actually is being done. And we have gotten some inspiration from how open source software is used, or how patents have been regulated for decades and decades using the global worldwide system of PCTs. And all that really helps to make AI transparent. Not at the level where you need to disclose the source code or where you're disclosing your IP. Our next question is about what agreements should the governments come upon when making regulations for AI technology around the world. That's a very valid question, and the way I will tackle this should be that governments inherently are slow. We have seen that here in the US, where to some extent the US Congress has been very slow to regulate and make laws. We have seen the same thing in the United Kingdom and a lot of the other European countries where some of the regulations are not just in par with the technology. And we also know that these regulations around AI is needed today. Now, we could wait 10 years for our regulators to come up with those regulations. But when we very clearly know that it's in the best interest of a big organization like Google or Facebook, it's also in the best interest of us, the public, when we are using these AI systems. If we know what's really happening and if we have some consensus, we could more easily use these systems. And of course, it's also in the best interest of the regulators and the governments. If we had AI regulation that was in par with how AI is being used today and built today, not even tomorrow or in the future, but even just today, we don't have to go to the courts all the time to get the answer, which was the case with South Wales Police, or which was the case with the predictive systems for grading that was used in the UK and then now here in the US. And there are many, many more examples for example, all the antitrust issues we are coming up with these bigger companies. The solution is to have a light touch regulations where we first of all align all the stakeholders who are responsible, from the people to the private sector to the public sector. And number two, come up with a self-regulatory framework where the government does not have to be involved, at least not right away. And that's something we have been working on. And if you are interested, please feel free to reach out to me directly or through our LinkedIn or Facebook page. Just to summarize, the regulation or some sort of regulation or a regulatory framework is actually needed today. And it does not need to involve either on the public sector or on the private sector to go deep into the technology. There are ways, and more essentially having the right amount of transparency to achieve that. Everyone of you may have also heard about explainability of a system or of an algorithm or of an AI system specifically. I will contest that transparency is at the heart of AI regulation, or to make these AI systems better, as opposed to explainability. And that's also because when we think about AI systems, most of the time today, the AI systems in place in deployment, for example, the one used by Facebook when you go to facebook.com to recommend feeds, or one used by Google for Google.com or for Google Translate, and all these systems are more or less more deterministic in the sense that they are based on pre-trained tagged data. It's a supervised system. We talked about that in our first live podcast a week or two back. But in the future, these systems will naturally be unsupervised. They'll use raw data. And for these, there's no way to explain how the answer was achieved. Plus, you don't need to know how it was done if you're getting the right answers. It's as simple as that. As long as you know that the system was well trained, it was well tested, and it was, and we have these all these organizations saying that these are great, these systems work. Thanks, everyone. I believe that should answer these two questions that you have. These are great questions, and I believe we on the technology side needs to play an important role when it comes to regulating AI. It's the it's on each one of us to not just defer regulations to the regulators, but it's for each one of us to think about how can we do the greater good. And that's what we have been doing. If you like to talk more to us about AI regulations or about what Skive is doing on building autonomous AI machines, feel free to reach out. Thank you.